The gavel struck like a thunderclap, silencing the courtroom's restless murmurs. Elias Whitaker, frail and bent with age, stepped through the heavy oak doors, his cane tapping a rhythm of defiance against the polished floor. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite his 87 years, locked onto the defendant, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Elias had not set foot in a courtroom in decades, not since the war trials of his youth when he'd testified against men whose crimes still haunted his dreams. Now, here he was, summoned by a letter he could barely read through his cataracts, called to bear witness in a case that stirred something deep and unspoken within him. The defendant, a young man named Caleb Morrow, sat rigid at the defense table, his face pale, his hands cuffed, accused of a hit-and-run that had left a young mother dead on a rain-slicked street. The courtroom was a theater of contrasts, the judge's stern gaze, the jurors' uneasy shifting, the prosecutor's polished confidence. Elias felt the weight of every stare as he shuffled to the witness stand, his coat threadbare but his posture unyielding. He'd lived long enough to know judgment wasn't confined to gavels. It lived in the eyes of strangers, in the whispers of a crowd. But Caleb's eyes, those were different. They weren't just scared. They were searching, pleading, as if Elias held some key to his soul's redemption. As Elias settled into the witness chair, his mind drifted to the night of the accident. He'd been there, on that desolate corner, under the flickering streetlight. He hadn't seen the car's make or license plate, his eyes weren't that good anymore, but he'd seen the figure behind the wheel, hunched, panicked, speeding into the dark. And he'd seen the woman, crumpled like a broken doll, her groceries scattered across the wet asphalt. Elias had knelt beside her, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood, but she was gone before the sirens came. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice like steel, began her questions. "Mr. Whitaker, can you confirm the defendant was the driver that night?" Elias's hands trembled on his cane. He looked at Caleb again, and something flickered in the young man's face: fear. Yes, but also something softer, something like regret. Elias's throat tightened. He'd come to point a finger, to deliver justice. But now, staring into Caleb's eyes, he felt a tug of memory, a ghost from his past he thought he'd buried. "I saw a shadow," Elias said, his voice low but steady. "A man in a car, driving too fast. I can't swear it was him." The courtroom stirred, murmurs rippling like wind through dry grass. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, but Elias didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that truth wasn't always a straight line. Sometimes it curved, like a river, carving paths you didn't expect. The questions continued, sharp and probing, but Elias's answers remained measured, his gaze never leaving Caleb. He spoke of the rain, the streetlight's flicker, the woman's stillness. He didn't mention the other memory that gnawed at him, a memory of another young man, decades ago, whose life had hung on Elias's words in a different courtroom. That man had been guilty, and Elias's testimony had sent him to prison. The weight of that choice had never left him. As the prosecutor stepped back, the defense attorney rose, a young man with nervous energy and a cheap suit. He asked Elias about his eyesight, his memory, his certainty. Elias answered honestly, his voice carrying the gravel of age and experience. But when the attorney asked if Elias believed Caleb was guilty, the old man paused. The courtroom fell silent, every ear straining for his words. "I don't know his heart," Elias said finally. "But I know what it looks like when a man carries a burden. That boy's carrying something." Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide, and for a moment, it was just the two of them in that crowded room, an old man and a young one, bound by something neither could name. The judge called a recess, and Elias stepped down, his cane tapping slower now, as if the weight of his words had settled into his bones. He passed Caleb's table, and the young man whispered something Elias couldn't quite hear, maybe a thank you, maybe a plea. Elias didn't stop. He walked out into the courthouse hall, where a woman waited, her face lined with grief and fury. She was the victim's mother, and her eyes burned into Elias like coals. "You saw him," she said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you say it was him?" Elias opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to tell her about the other young man, the one from 50 years ago, whose guilt had been certain, but whose punishment had haunted Elias ever since. He wanted to explain that truth wasn't just about facts, it was about mercy, about second chances. But her pain was too raw, and his words felt too small. As he left the courthouse, the rain began again, soft and cold against his face. Elias pulled his coat tighter, his mind tangled with questions. Had he done right by the woman who died? By her mother? By Caleb? He didn't know. All he knew was that Caleb's eyes had stirred something in him, a memory, a doubt, a hope. And as he walked into the gray evening, he felt the weight of another trial waiting, one that would demand more than his testimony. The rain followed Elias home, drumming against the tin roof of his small apartment like a restless spirit. He sat by the window, his hands curled around a chipped mug of coffee, staring at the street below where headlights cut through the dusk. Caleb's face lingered in his mind, those eyes, so young yet so heavy, like they carried a secret too big for one soul. Elias hadn't slept well since the trial began. Each night, he dreamed of that other courtroom, 50 years past, when he'd been a young man himself, testifying against a soldier accused of desertion during the war. That soldier, Thomas Reed, had begged for mercy, but Elias had spoken the truth. Thomas had run, leaving his squad to die. The gavel had fallen, and Thomas was gone, locked away for life. Elias had thought he'd done right, but the years had worn that certainty thin. What if he'd been wrong? What if mercy had been the better truth? Now, Caleb Morrow was pulling those old doubts to the surface. Elias didn't know why he couldn't point at the boy and say, "That's him." He'd seen the driver's silhouette, the car's frantic swerve. But something in Caleb's gaze, regret, maybe, or shame, had stopped him. Elias sipped his coffee, cold now, and wondered if he was losing his nerve or finding his heart. The next morning, he returned to the courtroom, his cane heavier in his hand. The air was thick with tension. The prosecution had new evidence, a grainy security video from a nearby gas station, showing a car like Caleb's speeding past minutes after the accident. The prosecutor played the clip, and the jurors leaned forward, their faces grim. Elias watched Caleb, whose head was bowed, his shoulders trembling. The boy looked like he was unraveling, and Elias felt a pang he couldn't name. Then came the twist. A new witness, a woman named Lila Carter, took the stand. She was in her 30s, with tired eyes and a nervous fidget, clutching a tissue like a lifeline. Lila claimed she'd been with Caleb that night, at a diner across town, when the accident happened. The courtroom buzzed. The prosecutor scoffed, calling her testimony convenient, but Lila's voice shook with conviction. "He was with me," she insisted. "We were talking about his mom, how sick she's been. He didn't leave till after midnight." Elias studied her. Lila wasn't polished like the lawyers or stoic like the judge. Her hands trembled, and her eyes darted to Caleb, not with love, but with something fiercer, loyalty, perhaps, or guilt. Elias wondered what tied her to the boy. A sister? A friend? Something more? Her testimony shifted the room's energy, casting doubt on the prosecution's timeline. The jurors whispered, and even the judge's expression softened. When Elias was called back to the stand, the prosecutor pressed harder. "Mr. Whitaker, you said you saw a shadow. Could it have been someone else?" Elias hesitated. Lila's words had planted a seed of doubt, but he couldn't shake the image of that car, that night. "It's possible," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The prosecutor pounced, accusing him of waffling, but Elias held firm. "I'm old, not blind. I know what I saw, but I don't know everything." The defense attorney seized the moment, painting Elias as a man of integrity, too honest to condemn without certainty. Elias felt uneasy being cast as a hero. He wasn't here to save Caleb or damn him. He was here for the truth, or as close to it as he could get. But Lila's testimony gnawed at him. If Caleb had been at that diner, who had Elias seen behind the wheel? And why did Lila look so desperate to protect him? After the session, Elias lingered in the courthouse hall, watching Lila hurry to Caleb's side. She whispered something, and Caleb nodded, his face a mix of relief and fear. Elias caught her eye, and for a moment, she froze, like a deer sensing danger. Then she turned away, guiding Caleb toward the exit. Elias wanted to call out, to ask what she was hiding, but his voice stayed trapped in his throat. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, a single bulb casting long shadows. He pulled out an old photo, creased and faded, of him and Thomas Reed before the war, two boys laughing under a summer sky. Thomas had been his friend, his brother in arms, until the day he ran. Elias had never forgiven himself for testifying against him, for choosing duty over loyalty. Now, With Caleb, he faced the same choice, but the lines were blurrier. The phone rang, startling him. It was the victim's mother, her voice raw with grief. "I heard about the new witness," she said. "Do you believe her?" Elias gripped the receiver, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm trying to understand." She hung up without another word, and Elias felt the weight of her pain settle beside his own. As he lay in bed that night, the rain returned, softer now, like a lullaby. Elias closed his eyes, seeing Caleb's face, Lila's trembling hands, and the ghost of Thomas Reed. He didn't know what tomorrow's testimony would bring, but he knew one thing. The truth was a fragile thing, and he was running out of time to find it. Elias woke to the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, as if it knew the trial was pulling him toward a reckoning. He dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, as if preparing for battle. Today, he would face the courtroom again, and with it, the ghosts of his past and the weight of Caleb's future. The courthouse was colder today, or perhaps it was just Elias's bones feeling the years. He took his seat in the gallery, not on the witness stand this time, but close enough to see every flicker of emotion on Caleb's face. The boy looked smaller, his eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. Lila sat behind him, her hands folded tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. Elias wondered again what bound her to Caleb, what secret made her risk perjury. The prosecution called an expert witness, a forensic analyst who dissected the security footage frame by frame. The car's make matched Caleb's, down to the dented fender. The timeline was too tight, the analyst argued, for Caleb to have been at the diner with Lila. The jurors nodded, their faces hardening. Elias felt a knot in his chest. The evidence was stacking against Caleb, and yet those eyes, that fleeting look of remorse, kept Elias tethered to doubt. Then came another twist. The defense called a surprise witness, an elderly mechanic named Amos, who shuffled to the stand with a limp and a scowl. Amos claimed he'd repaired Caleb's car the day before the accident, and the dented fender had been there for weeks, caused by a parking lot mishap. "Plenty of cars like that one out there," Amos grumbled. "You're pinning this on the wrong kid." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Elias leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Amos's testimony was a lifeline, but it also deepened the mystery. If Caleb's car wasn't unique, who else could have been driving that night? The prosecutor tore into Amos, questioning his memory and his ties to Caleb's family. Amos held his ground, his voice gruff but certain. Elias watched Lila during the exchange. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. She knew something, Elias was sure of it. He wanted to believe Amos, to believe Caleb was innocent, but the image of that car speeding into the dark wouldn't let go. When the court recessed, Elias followed Lila outside, his cane tapping a determined rhythm. She stood by a pillar, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You don't believe me, do you?" she said, not looking at him. Elias leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "I believe you're trying to save him," he said, "but I don't know why." Lila's eyes met his, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "He's my brother," she whispered. "He's all I've got left." The confession hit Elias like a wave. Suddenly, her desperation made sense. The diner story, the trembling hands, the fierce loyalty. She wasn't just protecting Caleb. She was protecting the only family she had. "Why lie?" Elias asked gently. Lila exhaled a plume of smoke, her voice breaking. "Because he was drunk that night. Not driving, but at home, passed out. I found him like that after I left the diner. If I tell the truth, they'll think he drove anyway." Elias's heart sank. Lila's lie was a gamble, one that could save Caleb or doom them both. He returned to the courtroom, his mind churning. The prosecution called their final witness, a neighbor who'd seen Caleb's car parked outside his house hours after the accident. The timeline was murky, but the implication was clear. Caleb had been out that night, not with Lila. Elias watched Caleb's face crumple, and for the first time, the boy looked guilty not of the crime, but of something deeper, something personal. Elias's thoughts drifted to Thomas Reed again. He'd never known what drove Thomas to desert, what fear or pain had broken him. Now, with Caleb, Elias saw a chance to ask questions he'd never asked back then. He scribbled a note and passed it to the defense attorney during a break. "Talk to Lila about Caleb's drinking. There's more to this." That night, Elias sat by his window, the rain now a steady drizzle. He thought of Lila's confession, of Caleb's haunted eyes, of the woman who died on that lonely street. He didn't have all the pieces, but he felt the truth circling closer, like a hawk descending. He prayed he'd have the strength to face it when it landed. The final day of the trial dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Elias arrived early, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest. He'd spent the night wrestling with memory-soft Thomas Reed, of the woman on the street, of Caleb's eyes and Lila's desperate lie. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. Caleb sat at the defense table, his face a mask of exhaustion, while Lila hovered behind him, her eyes darting nervously. Elias took his seat, his cane resting against his knee, and watched as the defense attorney called Lila back to the stand. The note Elias had passed had sparked something. Lila was about to tell the truth. Under oath, Lila's voice trembled but held firm. Caleb wasn't driving that night, she said. He was home, drunk, like I told Mr. Whitaker. I lied about the diner because I was scared they'd blame him anyway. The courtroom gasped, and Caleb's head dropped into his hands. Lila went on, tears streaming down her face. He's been struggling since our mom got sick. He drinks to forget, but he's not a killer. The prosecutor pounced, accusing Lila of perjury, but the judge silenced her with a sharp look. The jurors leaned forward, their faces a mix of sympathy and skepticism. Elias felt a strange relief wash over him. Lila's truth, painful as it was, had cracked the case open. But it also raised a question. If Caleb wasn't driving, who was? The defense attorney called one final witness, a tow truck driver who'd impounded a car matching the description of Caleb's, found abandoned 2 miles from the accident. The driver testified that the car's owner, a man named Derek Holt, had a history of DUIs and had fled town the night of the crash. The prosecution scrambled, but the evidence was compelling. Paint chips from the abandoned car matched traces found on the victim's clothing. Elias watched Caleb's shoulders slump, not with guilt, but with relief. The boy wasn't free, yet the jury still had to deliberate, but the truth was clearer now. Elias's testimony, his doubt, had given Lila the courage to speak, and that had shifted the tide. He felt a quiet pride, tempered by the weight of what he'd almost done. He'd come close to condemning Caleb, just as he'd condemned Thomas Reed all those years ago. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Elias met Caleb's eyes one last time. The boy mouthed, "Thank you," and Elias nodded, his throat tight. He thought of Thomas, of the letter he'd received years later, written from a prison cell. Thomas had forgiven him, had said he understood why Elias had testified. That letter had been Elias's salvation, a reminder that mercy could heal where justice wounded. Outside, the storm broke, rain lashing the courthouse steps. Elias stood under the awning, watching the world blur through the downpour. Lila approached, her eyes red but grateful. "You didn't have to help us," she said. Elias shook his head. "I didn't help you. I helped the truth." She smiled faintly, and for the first time, Elias saw hope in her face. The jury returned after 3 hours. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted, some with cheers, others with angry murmurs. Caleb hugged Lila, sobbing openly, while the victim's mother sat stone-faced, her grief a silent rebuke. Elias met her eyes as he left, and though she didn't speak, he felt her pain like a physical weight. He wanted to tell her that justice wasn't always enough, that healing came from understanding, but he knew she wasn't ready to hear it. As he walked home, the rain eased, and a faint rainbow arched across the sky. Elias thought of the woman who'd died, of Caleb's second chance, of Lila's courage. He thought of Thomas Reed, whose forgiveness had taught him that truth wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about the humanity that bound them all. Elias didn't know if he'd done right by everyone, but he'd done right by his heart.